The past rarely announces its secrets. It leaves them tucked between the margins, quiet marks on old paper, stray symbols and forgotten buildings, fragments of names that were never meant to survive. And yet, every so often, something slips through the cracks. A word, a shape, a boundary drawn with too much precision to be a mistake. That is where this story begins, with a name that should not exist, and yet appears everywhere the deeper you look. Tartaria. It is not a legend whispered by mystics or the invention of modern conspiracy. It is printed plainly on maps produced by the most respected cartographers of Europe. It sits along the northern expanses of Asia like a silent witness, unmoved by shifting borders or the collapse of kingdoms. For 3 centuries, the scholars of the West drew it confidently, an empire vast, formidable, and unmistakably real. And then, without warning, it vanished. Not shrank, not fragmented, not absorbed, vanished. If this were the story of an ordinary kingdom, history books would explain its rise and fall. They would name its rulers, its wars, its final crisis. But Tartaria leaves no such neat footprint. There is no last king, no final battle, no treaty, no dissolution, only a strange absence where an entire civilization used to be. This silence is not accidental. It is curated. When an idea disappears so completely that even its erasure must be erased, we are left with something far greater than a mystery. We are left with an intrusion and anomaly in the narrative we were taught to trust. The first time you encounter the word, it might feel harmless, a curiosity, a relic of old geography. That is exactly how it is meant to feel. But the more you look, the more insistent it becomes. Old atlases show Tartaria not as a blank wilderness, but as a structured domain with borders, subregions, cities, different nations, different centuries, different cartographers all depicting the same entity with a level of consistency that defies coincidence. These maps do not behave the way guesses behave. They behave the way memory behaves. And yet, the official explanation insists it was only a placeholder, Europe's fumbling attempt to label lands it did not understand. A catch-all term, they say, a linguistic convenience. But placeholders fade gradually as knowledge grows. They are replaced slowly, inconsistently, with overlap and hesitation. Tartaria, however, does not fade. It drops, abruptly, across nearly every mapmaker, every nation, every school of geography. One century, it is everywhere. The next, nowhere. This is not evolution. This is removal. And so, before a single brick, artifact, or ruin is examined, the first fracture appears not in the past, but in the story we have been told about it. Something existed, and something acted to make sure we would forget it. Something large enough to leave marks on the world, and yet fragile enough that those marks were later treated as errors. History does not normally behave this way. History leaves scars, echoes, debris. For Tartaria, we are left with maps that remember what we no longer do, and a mystery that grows every time someone tries to explain it away. But a name alone is not enough to disturb the foundations of our understanding. A name could still be a myth, a misunderstanding, an embellishment of early explorers. If Tartaria were only a word, the story might end here. But words have gravity when they repeat themselves across continents. And the word Tartaria refuses to remain flat. It leads outward to architecture that should not exist. 2 disasters that read like deliberate erasures. 2 testimonies buried under layers of soil, ash, and silence. It also leads inward to questions that strike at the foundation of who we believe we are. Because if a civilization capable of spanning half a continent truly once stood, and then was deliberately removed from our memory, what does that say about the history we inherit so confidently? More importantly, what does it say about those who decide which pieces of the past we are permitted to see? Every mystery begins with something small or misaligned detail, an inconsistency so subtle it could be ignored. But as the pieces gather, they stop behaving like coincidences. They begin to assemble themselves into a shape, a quiet silhouette of something enormous. Tartaria is that silhouette, a civilization described not by its storytellers, but by its absence. And absence can be louder than fact when it repeats itself long enough. As we stand at the threshold of this story, one truth becomes unavoidable. The erasure of Tartaria was not the aftermath of its collapse. It was the collapse. The destruction was not a side effect. It was the objective. Civilizations vanish through conquest, famine, disease. They do not vanish through editing. And yet Tartaria did. It was not forgotten. It was buried. This is where our journey begins, not with the ruins of a lost world, but with the deliberate stillness that fell over its memory. A stillness too uniform to be natural, too complete to be accidental. Somewhere beneath the maps, beneath the contradictions, beneath the silence itself, an entire civilization waits, not to be restored, but to be acknowledged. The question is not whether Tartaria existed. The maps already answered that. The question is why someone wanted us to believe it didn't. And that question will open the first door. The deeper you venture into the cartographic record, the harder it becomes to dismiss Tartaria as a misunderstanding. Maps, more than any other artifact, reflect how a civilization understood the world at a given moment. They are mirrors of collective knowledge, crafted not by poets or mystics, but by scholars whose reputations depended on accuracy. Errors appear, yes, but errors do not persist for centuries across nations, academies, and political rivalries. And yet Tartaria does exactly that. It endures. It appears again and again, drawn with confidence, labeled with authority, mapped with borders too deliberate to be dismissed as artistic flourishes. The first time you encounter it, perhaps on the 1570 Theatrum Orbis Terram by Abraham Ortelius, it sits across northern Asia like a silent colossus. Not an empty white space, not a suggestion of unknown lands, but a structured region with rivers, cities, internal divisions. The map does not apologize for this. It does not hedge or hesitate. Ortelius, the father of the modern atlas, draws Tartaria with the same certainty that he draws Spain, France, or Persia. And other cartographers follow him not by copying blindly, but by reinforcing a consensus. Willem and Hendrik Hondius, masters of Dutch cartography, depict Tartaria not as a suggestion but as a geopolitical fact. French cartographers echo the same outline. German scholars add finer details, mountain ranges, trade routes, indicators of population density. Italian atlases carve the same borders into ornate engravings. The most striking element is not the presence of Tartaria itself, but the consistency of its portrayal. This is not a phantom created by a single imagination. It is a memory shared across an entire intellectual community. And then, the memory fractures. Not gradually, as new expeditions refine old knowledge, but sharply, almost surgically. By the late 18th century, the borders of Tartaria begin to shrink not as regions are conquered or renamed, but as if an eraser has been dragged across the page. By the mid-19th century, the term nearly disappears. Siberia expands. Mongolia stabilizes. Manchuria is absorbed. Kazakhstan emerges. The cartographic world that once included a vast, unified Tartaria now presents a mosaic of modern states, none of which claimed lineage to the name that dominated maps for centuries. The official explanation insists that Tartaria was merely an umbrella term, European attempt to label lands that were poorly understood, inhabited by nomadic tribes who did not form a centralized empire. According to this view, the disappearance of Tartaria is not suspicious at all. It is progress. It is accuracy. As Russian and Chinese explorers filled into blank spaces, the placeholder dissolved. History, we are told, simply came into focus. But placeholders are vague by nature. They are drawn loosely, tentatively, without clear boundaries or internal subdivisions. Placeholders behave like fog, gradually dispersing as knowledge grows. Tartaria, however, behaves like something else. It behaves like a structure. Its borders are too precise. Its divisions too consistent. Its placement too deliberate. This is not fog. This is architecture. And architecture does not vanish because explorers become more thorough. Architecture vanishes because someone tears it down. There is another detail that does not fit the placeholder narrative. The Supragians' ancient maps label Tartaria, Deserta, Tartaria, Antiqua, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, Muscovite Tartary. Placeholders are not subdivided. Ignorance does not produce complexity. Knowledge produces complexity. The maps suggest not a misunderstanding, but an organized system, one that made sense to the map makers of the time, and then suddenly stopped making sense at all. To stand before these maps is to feel a subtle but unmistakable dissonance. You are looking at documents created by scholars who prided themselves on precision. Their atlases guided explorers, merchants, and kings. These men were not casual dabblers sketching mythological lands. They were the compilers of reality as their world understood it. If they believed Tartaria existed, if they believed it had cities and boundaries, then the name represented something that was considered real enough to print, reprint, and reaffirm for nearly 300 years. And then someone decided it should not be considered real at all. The timing of the erasure is as unsettling as the erasure itself. The 19th century is a period of profound transformation, industrial revolutions, political upheavals, scientific consolidation, and global reorganization. It is also the century that produces some of the greatest historical distortions, deliberate or accidental. Borders are redrawn. Narratives are restructured. Empires consolidate. Institutions rise with the authority to decide what counts as legitimate knowledge. In this environment, the disappearance of Tartaria does not look like refinement, it looks like revision. There is a particular moment when the silence becomes too loud to ignore. If you examine the atlas revisions from 1800 to 1900, you notice a pattern. Tartaria does not fade, it is overwritten. New labels occupy its territory. New political entities are drawn with confidence. It is as if the cartographers of the 19th century are not discovering the world, but reassigning it. And reassignment requires authority, an authority strong enough to tell scholars, explorers, and mapmakers that a name used for centuries must now be discarded. What could command such coordinated compliance? What power could instruct the global intellectual class to forget a word so large it once dwarfed entire continents? The answer may lie not in what was gained, but in what was lost. For if Tartaria truly represented a civilization, one with its own culture, technology, and influence, then removing its name from the map is not a correction, it is a burial. A burial accomplished not with shovels or fire, but with ink, a cartographic extinction. Maps are supposed to remember. They cling to outdated names and boundaries long after they have changed on the ground. They preserve ghosts. They are the last places where vanished kingdoms continue to exist. That is why the disappearance of Tartaria is so disturbing. Maps should not forget. And yet, these maps do. They forget with a speed and unanimity that suggests not natural evolution, but deliberate intervention. It is here, in the silence of the maps, that the story deepens. Because if the maps forgot at someone's request, what else were we asked to forget? And what traces remain in the world, traces too large to be erased as easily as ink on paper? The answer lies not in documents, but in stone. Not in labels, but in structures. The next footprint of Tartaria does not lie on maps that remember what we no longer do. It lies in the buildings that were never meant to survive the erasure. History teaches us to see the past in clean line stripes. Empires, invasions, collapses, but the reality beneath those lines is rarely clean. It is layered, contradictory, and filled with deliberate distortions. Nowhere is this distortion more visible than in the story we are told about the peoples of the Eurasian steppe. The narrative begins simply. Fierce nomads, scattered tribes, united briefly under a single brutal conqueror, Genghis Khan, the Mongol hordes, the horsemen who swept across continents with fire and terror. It is a story so often repeated, so deeply embedded in our imagination, that questioning it feels almost sacrilegious. And yet, the deeper you look, the more that story begins to dissolve. Not because it lacks detail, but because it lacks proportion. The Mongol Empire, we are told, became the largest contiguous land empire in human history, through force alone, millions, subjugated by small bands of riders wielding superior tactics and ruthless discipline. They conquered China, they crushed Persia, they stormed into Eastern Europe, and for a moment, it seems to explain everything. Or rather, it seems to explain everything, except the one civilization that should have been impossible for nomadic conquerors to erase. The civilization that once occupied the same massive northern expanse, labeled again and again as Tartaria. The official narrative insists that Tartaria was nothing more than a linguistic convenience. European cartographers lumping various Turkic and Mongol groups into a single vague category. According to this explanation, the Mongol Empire did not conquer Tartaria, it was Tartaria, or at least the peoples Europeans mistakenly called by that name. But this explanation contains a paradox too large to ignore. If Tartaria was merely a label for diverse nomads, why were the maps so consistent, so confident, so structured? Why did they show divisions: independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Great Tartary, that mirror the administrative structure of an organized society rather than the chaotic sprawl of nomadic tribes? The truth may lie not in what the Mongol Empire did, but in what it obscured. The image of the nomadic barbarians sweeping across civilization with overwhelming brutality is a convenient one. It allows the victors of later centuries to justify their own narratives. It lets them reduce an entire region of the world to a caricature of savagery, thereby dismissing any evidence of sophistication as too advanced for the locals or mysterious relics with no known builders. It is a narrative that sanitizes the destruction of cities, technologies, and cultures by attributing their disappearance to Mongol devastation rather than deliberate erasure by later powers. The more you examine the accounts of the Mongol invasions, the more they begin to resemble something closer to mythological retellings, exaggerated, contradictory, and curated. Some chronicles describe unstoppable hordes numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Others note suspicious gaps where cities are said to have been annihilated despite scant evidence of mass slaughter. Even the descriptions of Genghis Khan's origins shift dramatically across sources, as if the chroniclers struggled to reconcile a single individual with the scale of transformation attributed to him. But the greatest inconsistency is architectural. Nomadic societies do not build monumental structures. They do not construct star forts, cathedrals with precise acoustics, or vast stone complexes aligned with magnetic ley lines. They do not leave behind cities whose engineering exceeds that of the sedentary civilizations surrounding them. And yet, the regions labeled as Tartaria contain exactly such structures: mile-wide fortifications, impossible cathedrals, and palatial government buildings that would have required a mastery of engineering, geometry, and energy theory far beyond what is attributed to medieval nomads. If these structures were not built by the Mongols, then who did build them? And why does the historical record suddenly fracture at the moment when the Mongol Empire supposedly rose? The answer emerging from the shadows of this question is unsettling. Perhaps the Mongols were not the destroyers of Tartaria, but the last witnesses to a civilization already in decline, or worse, already under attack. There are whispers in certain historical traditions that Genghis Khan was less a conqueror and more a unifier, a leader who attempted to reassemble fragmented remnants of a once great cultural sphere. This interpretation is not the one taught in schools, but it aligns with patterns seen in other civilizations whose histories were later rewritten. When an empire is targeted for erasure, its heroes become villains, its scientists become mystics, its accomplishments become anomalies, and its final defenders are rebranded as demons or barbarians. What if the figure we know as Genghis Khan was recast through the lens of those who came later, those who benefited from the collapse of a civilization that once spanned half the world? What if his campaigns, brutal though they might have been, were not the beginning of destruction, but the desperate final movements of a world already being dismantled by a different, quieter force? A force that would eventually finish the job not with arrows and fire, but with ink, institutions, and a rewritten timeline. This leads to a possibility, even more provocative, that Tartaria was not a loose collection of tribes, but a unified civilization, whose cultural memory survived in fragmented form after its collapse. The nomadic groups labeled Tatars and Mongols may not have been the remnants of primitive tribes, but the descendants of a fallen technological society struggling to survive in a world that had suddenly turned hostile. Their mobility, their resilience, their legendary endurance perhaps. These were adaptations to a world where their cities had been buried, their infrastructure destroyed, their knowledge confiscated or suppressed. And as centuries passed, the identity of Tartaria dissolved into the stories of conquerors. The heirs of a fallen civilization were recast as the destroyers of others. The cities they could no longer maintain were attributed to unrelated cultures. The ruins they inhabited became mysteries. The technology they once possessed, if it survived at all, became myth. This shift from heirs to hordes is the sleight of hand that defines this chapter of history. A civilization cannot be erased by force alone. It must be replaced in memory. It must be overwritten with a story that makes the truth unthinkable. The Mongol narrative, repeated endlessly across textbooks and documentaries, serves as that replacement. It explains just enough to prevent deeper questions. It simplifies a region too vast and too complex into a single image. A rider on horseback, bow drawn, flames trailing behind him, but beneath that image lies a different silhouette, one made of star forts, impossible buildings, and a legacy that reaches far beyond the story of any nomadic empire. To see that silhouette, you must look not at the chronicles, but at the land itself. The next clues do not come from historians. They come from stone, symmetry, and the strange machinery hidden in plain sight within the architecture of the Old World. The first time you stand beneath one of those Old World structures, the ones with impossible domes, ornate spires, and foundations that seem to hum with a quiet intentionality, you feel something you cannot fully articulate. It is not beauty alone, though beauty is everywhere. It is not scale alone, though the scale is overwhelming. It is a sense that the building knows something, that it was designed not merely to be seen, but to do something. And once that feeling settles over you, it refuses to leave. Because these structures do not behave like architecture. They behave like machines. Begin with the domes. They rise from the earth with an elegance that looks effortless. Yet their engineering defies the capabilities of the centuries that supposedly built them. Copper-clad curves, mathematically perfect arcs, internal chambers aligned with celestial angles, these features are not accidental. They are functional. They appear in government buildings, cathedrals, train stations, libraries, observatories across continents, cultures, and eras that had no communication with one another. And yet, the design language is identical, as if all were built by architects reading from the same blueprint. A blueprint we no longer possess. From the domes, your eyes travel upward to the spires, those needle-like towers that taper into ornate metal finials. The official explanation insists they are decorative. But when you study their structure, their materials, their placement, a different picture emerges. Copper, iron, gold, leaf, all excellent conductors. All arranged in geometries strikingly similar to early radio antennas and resonance towers. It is as though these buildings were designed to pull something from the air to gather, channel, amplify. Then there are the star forts. At ground level, they are strange. From above, they are astonishing. Perfect geometric shaped stars with 6, 8, 12 points surrounded by motes that look less defensive than conductive. Water, stone, and earth arranged in patterns nearly identical to cymatic images. The geometric shapes formed when sound vibrates through matter. According to mainstream historians, these star forts were military defenses designed to withstand cannon fire. But many of them were built before cannon warfare even existed in those regions. Others were constructed in places that held no strategic military value, and a surprising number have cathedrals or energy-like structures at their centers, as if the fort was not protecting the building, but powering it. Patterns repeat, materials repeat, angles repeat. It is not chaos. It is a system. And yet, we are told to ignore this system. We are told these are coincidences, stylistic preferences, artistic flourishes. We are told to accept that cathedrals in France resemble train stations in Russia, which resemble courthouses in the United States because of architectural influence, a term that explains everything and nothing. Influence should produce variety. This produces uniformity. There is an even deeper peculiarity, one that reveals itself only when you stand inside these buildings. Sound behaves differently. Whispers travel along curves. Vibrations gather beneath domes. A single note played beneath a vaulted ceiling seems to expand, to resonate, to thicken the air itself. Acousticians today still struggle to explain how such precision was achieved with the tools available at the time. But perhaps the assumption is wrong. Perhaps the builders had tools we do not know about. Tools that work with resonance, frequency, atmospheric charge, tools that blend science with geometry in ways our modern world has forgotten. This brings us inevitably to the name that hovers at the edges of every conversation about lost energy: Nikola Tesla. A mind whose ideas were too advanced for his era. A man who spoke openly of pulling electricity from the air, of transmitting energy wirelessly across continents. His Wardenclyffe Tower, the structure he built to demonstrate atmospheric energy, looks eerily similar to the domes and spires of those old Tartarian buildings. The geometry aligns, the materials match, the principles overlap. And yet, we are told Tesla was an eccentric inventor, not a rediscoverer of something far older, far more complete. If Tesla was rediscovering Tartarian technology rather than inventing it, then the buildings that line our cities are not relics. They are remnants. Silent machines from a civilization that understood energy not as a commodity to be bought and sold, but as a natural property of the world, something abundant, clean, and free. And if that is true, the implications are staggering. Free energy means no hierarchy, no scarcity, no empires built on oil, coal, or electricity grids, a world without dependency, a world without control. And a world like that would not be tolerated by those who benefit from control. This is where the story shifts. The resemblance between Tartarian architecture and energy machinery may not be a coincidence. It may be the very reason these structures were dismantled, repurposed, or destroyed. The ornate facades, the towering spires, the grand domes, these may have been the physical components of an energy network that once spanned continents. A network erased precisely because it threatened the foundation of the emerging industrial world. A world built on scarcity and profit. Ask yourself, why do so many of these buildings today sit empty, stripped of their original mechanisms, filled instead with wires, heating systems, electrical panels that look clumsy and retrofitted? Why do old photographs show street lamps glowing with an intensity that seems electric decades before widespread electrification? Why do cities across the world share the same architectural DNA despite having no historical reason to? The simplest answer is also the most forbidden. They were built by the same civilization, a civilization whose memory was buried, whose technology was confiscated, whose buildings were repurposed into government halls, cathedrals, and museums, symbols of authority that once served a very different purpose. Architecture is not meant to behave like machinery, but Tartarian architecture does. It hums, resonates, conducts, aligns. It carries the fingerprints of a lost science. And the deeper one looks, the clearer the pattern becomes. The buildings of the old world were not designed simply to shelter. They were designed to function, and their function did not serve the world that replaced them. If these structures were machines, then the civilization that built them must have possessed knowledge we can barely imagine. Knowledge that was not lost through time, but taken, sealed away beneath the foundations of our modern understanding. To find the next clue, we must return to the moment when this architecture was reintroduced to the world not as technology, but as spectacle. The moment when entire cities of these impossible structures were unveiled, admired, and then destroyed in silence. There is a moment in history when the old world architecture of Tartaria reappears not as relics, not as ruins, but as entire cities, complete and immaculate, rising in places where no such cities should have existed. This moment, presented to us as a celebration of human achievement, is known as the World's Fairs. Chicago, 1893, St. Louis, 1904, San Francisco, 1915, names that sound harmless, even nostalgic, frozen in sepia tones, accompanied by music boxers and the romance of an innocent age. Yet beneath the nostalgia lies something profoundly unsettling, because the cities built for these fairs were not simply impressive, they were impossible. You are told that in Chicago, a swampy, undeveloped stretch of land was transformed in just over 2 years into the White City, an architectural utopia of gleaming palaces, endless colonnades, domed temples reflecting pools, grand boulevards, and monumental halls so vast they dwarfed the modern skyscrapers of their time. 2 years using horse-drawn carts, hand tools, wooden scaffolding, and a workforce with no access to modern machinery. Official history demands that we accept this without hesitation, celebrating it as a triumph of ambition and ingenuity. But ambition does not bend physics, and ingenuity does not ignore the constraints of time and labor. Consider the manufactures and liberal arts building in Chicago, the crown jewel of the White City. Its footprint covered more than 30 acres. Its interior could house the U.S. Capitol, St. Paul's Cathedral, and the Great Pyramid simultaneously. Its roof, spanning nearly 370 feet, was supported by steel trusses larger than anything produced in America at the time. And yet, we are told this building was planned, designed, fabricated, transported, and assembled in less than 24 months. There are no photographs of the steel trusses being cast, shipped, or erected. There is no record of the supply chains that would have been required. There is no documentation of the skilled labor force needed to create the unprecedented curvature of its arches. Instead, What we have are photographs of the buildings complete, finished, perfect, and then, photographs of their destruction, the beginning and the end, but almost nothing in between. This absence becomes even more suspicious when you learn that the buildings were allegedly temporary, constructed from staff, a mixture of plaster and fiber that could mimic stone but crumble under weather. We are told this explains the speed of construction, but even plaster shells require wooden frames, scaffolding, surface detail, carving, molding, painting, and finishing. They require time, they require manpower, and most importantly, they require documentations, something the late 19th century produced in abundance. Photographs of laborers building bridges, railways, tunnels, ships, factories, everything except the largest, most ambitious construction projects ever undertaken on American soil. This pattern repeats at other fairs. St. Louis, 1904, a city that suddenly manifests an entire landscape of ornate stone palaces, colonnades, fountains, and massive domes, only to be dismantled within months of the exposition's end. San Francisco, 1915, just 9 years after the devastating 1906 earthquake, the city is somehow capable of producing another impossible architectural wonderland, complete with the Palace of Fine Arts, a structure so magnificent and so durable it still stands today, despite being described as temporary plaster. Again, construction photos are scarce. Again, documentation is suspiciously thin. Again, the timeline strains belief. When patterns repeat, it is no longer anomaly, it is signature. The conspiracy interpretation proposes a radically different story, one that transforms the world, as fairs from celebrations of progress into carefully orchestrated funerals. According to this view, the buildings were not constructed for the fairs. They were discovered, excavated, restored, repurposed, and showcased one last time before being destroyed. The fairs were not the birth of modern architecture. They were the burial of an older one, a global unveiling followed by a systematic erasure. To accept this possibility, you must look at the world not as a linear progression, but as a palimpsest, layers of civilizations written atop one another, with older layers scraped away or overwritten to make room for new narratives. The White City becomes a fragment of that older layer, temporarily revealed. The ornate palaces of St. Louis become artifacts from a buried past. The Palace of Fine Arts becomes a survivor, its longevity, an accidental confession. There is another detail that deepens the mystery: the fires. After nearly every fair, large portions of the structures were destroyed by accidental fires, uncontrollable, convenient, always after the public had gone home. Chicago burned, St. Louis burned, San Francisco burned. Buildings described as temporary but clearly built with heavy stone, steel, and reinforced foundations crumbled not under the weight of weather but under intentional neglect or rapid demolition. Destruction is easier to justify when you call something temporary, but there is a deeper motive beneath the smoke and rubble. If these buildings were remnants of Tartaria, if they functioned not merely as monuments but as components of a free energy grid, then their destruction was not aesthetic. It was strategic. Removing them meant severing the last physical ties to a civilization whose technology could undermine the emerging industrial power structures of the world. Energy monopolies cannot coexist with free atmospheric energy. Centralized governments cannot coexist with decentralized abundance. And so, the relics of that abundance had to be erased under the guise of progress. Consider one more anomaly: the near-total absence of builders in the photographic record. Contrasted with the overwhelming presence of people in the demolition photos, it is easier to take apart a machine you do not understand than to build it. And the workers shown tearing down these structures seem to be doing exactly that, not demolishing a fragile plaster shell, but struggling against a stone fortress. This inversion, ease of construction, difficulty of destruction, makes no sense if the structures were truly temporary. But it makes perfect sense if they were discovered, not built. The world's fairs stand as the most visible, most undeniable intersection between the world we know and the world we were meant to forget. They are the hinge between two eras, one built on resonance, symmetry, and energy, the other built on wires, engines, and fuel. To follow the trail further, we must look not at cities erected overnight, but at cities partially buried places, where the ground itself seems to have swallowed the first floors of buildings, leaving only half-visible clues of a world drowned not in water, but in something far stranger. There is a moment when the architectural anomalies of the old world stop looking like quirks and begin looking like symptoms. A pattern emerges, quiet, universal, impossible to deny once you see it. Windows half buried in sidewalks, doorways that open into dirt, first floors functioning as basements, streets elevated far above what appears to be the original ground level, entire city blocks that seem to have sunk, not over centuries, but all at once. These features appear not in one nation or one climate, but everywhere. Parties in Moscow, New York, Melbourne, Idas in Istanbul, Edinburgh, cities whose histories are entirely unrelated, share the same eerie scar. A world built deeper than the surface we now walk on. Official archaeology explains this phenomenon with a single phrase: rising street levels. Roads are repaved, utilities added, foundations reinforced. cities grow upward over time, leaving older layers below. And on paper, this explanation sounds reasonable. But when you stand before a 3-meter-tall window sunk halfway into the earth, framed by stonework too deliberate to be accidental, you feel the explanation strain. When entire neighborhoods sit beneath modern sidewalks, when ornate arches lie buried in dirt, when staircases descend to what used to be the main entrance, the narrative begins to break. This is not the slow accumulation of centuries. This is something abrupt, something more like burial than evolution. The deeper you look, the more you begin to see a single event, a moment when the world did not flood with water, but with earth itself. A moment when soil behaved like a wave, not rising gently, but crashing violently. A moment when the ground liquefied, surged, and set again like cement. This is the essence of the mud flood theory, a global cataclysm that left cities partially submerged under meters of earth, not eroded by time, but entombed in an instant. The most unsettling part of this theory is how well it matches the photographic evidence from the 19th century. Consider the images of excavations, men digging downward to expose doors, windows, entire facades buried under packed soil. These photos are often labeled as construction, but construction normally builds up, not down. In many images, the workers appear not to be building foundations but uncovering them. Stone arches emerge from soil like fossils. Staircases descend into rooms filled with earth that had to be shoveled out before they could be used again. These are not basements. These are ground floors lost beneath a layer of mud that hardened into the streets we stand on today. Seattle's underground city is perhaps the most famous example. A fire in 1889 destroyed the surface structures, and the city responded by raising its streets 1 to 2 stories higher. But beneath those streets, the original sidewalks remain intact, windows, doors, and storefronts preserved like the remains of an older world. The official narrative insists this was intentional engineering, but if that is true, Seattle is a peculiar anomaly. Until you realize it is not an anomaly at all. It is a rare city where the burial was documented rather than hidden. Elsewhere, the burial is simply accepted as how the city was built, even when the evidence contradicts this. In Eastern Europe, entire buildings from the 18th century sit half-buried with original entrances now below ground. In Turkey, Ottoman structures display windows at dirt level, their stone ornamentation extending far beneath the modern street. In the United States, countless Victorian buildings show the same pattern: first floors beneath earth, second floors functioning as ground level. A global pattern requires a global cause. That is where the mud flood theory goes from peculiar to haunting. Proponents point to a series of unusual events in the early 19th century. The 1816 year without a summer, caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora, reports of atmospheric anomalies, temperature drops, strange red and brown snow across Europe, unexplained earthquakes, mysterious storms. These events, scattered across continents, may be pieces of a single puzzle, geological or atmospheric shift powerful enough to destabilize soil on a global scale. Imagine, for a moment, that the world did not sink slowly, but all at once that soil liquefied under cities, surging upward like a tide, engulfing lower stories before settling again. Buildings designed with symmetry and complexity suddenly found their lower halves sealed away. Streets had to be rebuilt, not because of design flaws, but because the original streets were gone. A civilization caught in such a disaster would not record the event as a flood. They would record it as a judgment, a curse, a calamity too vast to comprehend. And if the survivors were not the original inhabitants, if they arrived afterward, they would have no memory of the event at all. Which brings us to the most delicate part of the narrative. The possibility that the mud flood was not simply a natural disaster, but a weapon, a targeted erasure, a cleansing of cities belonging to a civilization that could not be conquered by war alone. If Tartaria truly possessed energy technology, architectural mastery, and infrastructures that threatened emerging industrial empires, then burying its cities literally would have been a devastatingly effective way to erase its presence. Once buried, these buildings could be reassigned, renovated, labeled as Victorian, neoclassical, Baroque, depending on who claimed them. Their deeper floors could be ignored, sealed, or reinterpreted. A new civilization could be placed atop the ruins, inheriting a world it did not build, believing itself to be the first. And once the ground hardened, once the memory faded, the burial would become invisible. But it is not invisible. Not anymore, because the earth does not lie. Doorways still emerge from sidewalks. Archways still peek from beneath asphalt. Windows still open into dirt. These buried fragments whisper the same message across continents. This was not built in the wrong place. The ground moved, and it moved suddenly. If the mud flood was the mechanism that erased Tartaria from the physical world, then the next question becomes inevitable. What happened to the people who lived in those half-buried cities? How does an empire vanish not only from the ground, but from the population? To answer that, we must step into the tall shadows of buildings too large for the humans who supposedly built them, and into the forbidden chapter of history that speaks not of ordinary people, but of giants. Walk through any grand building of the old world, one untouched by modern renovations, and an unsettling question begins to emerge. It is not spoken aloud. It grows silently, in the way your footsteps echo too softly in a hall that seems designed for something larger, in the way your hand barely reaches the midpoint of a door meant to be opened by someone twice your height, in the way a single step of a staircase rises just a little too high, forcing an awkward stretch every time you climb it. These buildings do not feel built for us. They feel inherited. The ceilings rise 50, 60, even 70 feet above the floor, pointlessly high, for heating, acoustics, or function. Doors, tower, 12 or 15 feet tall, heavy enough that a person of our size could not swing them easily without mechanical assistance. Window frames begin far above eye level. Mantels on fireplaces rise to shoulder height or higher. Desks, chairs, podiums, pulpits, all of them, in photographs from the 19th century, appear strangely oversized for the people standing beside them. And this is not confined to one country or one architectural style, it is universal. When a pattern appears everywhere, you must stop attributing it to coincidence. Mainstream historians explain this oversized architecture as monumental design structures meant to inspire awe and communicate power. It is a neat explanation, tidy and reassuring, but the explanation collapses the moment you compare the scale to the needs of the inhabitants. Power does not require doors twice your height. ODO does not require windows you cannot reach. Vanity does not produce uniform proportions across continents. Symbolism can only explain so much. At a certain point, the architectural scale stops looking symbolic and starts looking practical, precisely the size one would expect for a population significantly larger than ours. Here, the conspiracy deepens. Because if buildings were once sized for larger humans, then where are those humans now? Why does no museum display the skeleton of a 10 or 12 foot tall person? Why does the official record insist that humans have always been roughly the same size? Why do anthropologists speak of gigantism as a rare disease, rather than a remnant of a larger physiology? The answer lies buried in forgotten newspapers, lost archives, and whispered allegations about institutions that guard the boundaries of official history. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, local newspapers across America published hundreds of articles about the discovery of giant skeletons at 9, even 12 feet tall unearths from burial mounds, ancient tombs, and deep earthworks. Farmers plowing their fields, miners digging tunnels, construction crews laying foundations. Again and again, the same story. Enormous bones, anomalous skulls, unusual dentistry, elongated features, sometimes even double rows of teeth. The consistency of the reports is startling. These were not fringe publications. Many appeared in reputable regional newspapers: the New York Times, the San Diego Union, the St. Paul Globe, the Kansas City Journal. The articles frequently mention another detail, more troubling than the discoveries themselves: the involvement of the Smithsonian Institution. The pattern is always the same. Skeleton discovered. Smithsonian agents arrive. Remains are collected. And then silence. No further reporting. No catalog entries. No museum displays. No published studies. The bones simply vanish. It is tempting to call this coincidence an archiving error, a mismeasurement, a hoax. But when hundreds of reports all end the same way, coincidence becomes the least convincing option. Institutions do not accidentally lose that many anomalous skeletons. They either do not want to keep them, or do not want others to see them. The official story dismisses these reports as exaggerations or journalistic sensationalism. Yet the architectural evidence contradicts this dismissal. Architecture does not exaggerate. Architecture does not sensationalize. Architecture records the scale of those who build it. The oversized doors, the cavernous rooms, the massive furnishings, the unreachable windows. These are not metaphors. They are measurements. If the Tartarian civilization truly existed and, if it possessed advanced energy technologies, resonant architecture, and a unified global style, then it would not be surprising for its population to differ physiologically from ours. A civilization capable of erecting star forts, domes with impossible spans, and monumental complexes on a scale unmatched even today might well have been built by people whose bodies matched the proportions of their cities. This idea is not unique to conspiracy circles. Nearly all ancient cultures contain stories of giants. The Nephilim of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Titans of Greece, the Jotun of Norse myth, the Quinametsin of Mesoamerica, the Datius of India, the Anakim of Canaan, the giants of Native American oral traditions. These stories, dismissed as myth today, may be distant memories of a race that once walked the earth before the mud buried their cities and the institutions buried their bones. If so, then the disappearance of giant skeletons is not a mystery, it is a strategy. A civilization cannot be erased from history unless its inhabitants are erased as well. The mud flood may have buried their architecture, the fires may have erased their machines, the World's Fairs may have rebranded their buildings, but the bones, those were the most dangerous evidence of all. Bones cannot lie. Bones cannot be edited. Bones do not fit the narrative of linear human evolution. Bones would force us to confront the possibility that we are not the first advanced species to inhabit this earth. But even giants do not vanish without a trace. Their scale remains built into the world around us, quietly accusing the official timeline. And their disappearance raises one final question, perhaps the most unsettling of all. If the people of Tartaria were removed from their own cities, who replaced them? Because after the mud settled, after the smoke cleared, after the great erasures of the 19th century, something strange appears in the photographic record. Cities vast, immaculate, perfectly preserved stand, silent and empty. Streets devoid of movement, boulevards without a single passerby, blocks without horses, carriages, or signs of life. As if the world had been cleared waiting for a new population. And that is where the story turns from mystery to indictment, from speculation to implication. Because the next era is not marked by ruins or bones, but by orphan trains. If every mystery up to this point has the feeling of a riddle, maps, buildings, bones, then what comes next feels more like an accusation, because a civilization does not simply vanish, it is removed. And the 19th century, when viewed without the filter of official narratives, reads less like a century of progress and more like the closing act of a coordinated erasure. Look closely at the historical record for that period. You will not find a single cataclysm that ended Tartaria. Will find many. Fires that consumed entire cities with impossible speed, floods that tore through urban centers, earthquakes with strangely selective destruction patterns, wars that redrew continents, and always, behind each catastrophe, the same silent consequence. Populations displaced, buildings cleared, and official documentation rewritten. Start with the fires. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 is still taught as a freak accident. Mrs. O'Leary's cow, a lantern, a barn. This comforting fable is repeated endlessly, but eyewitness testimony tells another story. Fireballs falling from the sky, flames that jumped rivers, buildings exploding from the inside out with no clear ignition source. And when the smoke cleared, something extraordinary appeared in the photograph's Tartarian-style architecture reduced to molten shells, their stone facades warped as if exposed to temperatures far beyond those of a normal urban fire. Meanwhile, rows of wooden houses nearby remained mysteriously unburned. Chicago was not unique. Hamburg in 1842, Constantinople in 1870, Boston in 1872, Oshkosh in 1875, Seattle in 1889, Vancouver in 1886, Toronto in 1904, city after city, across continents. Burned with unnatural intensity, and always the same kind of buildings bore the brunt. The monumental stone and brick architecture theorists attribute to Tartarian builders. Then there were the floods. From St. Petersburg to Paris, from Melbourne to New York. Photographs from the mid-late 1800s reveal entire ground floors buried under several feet of compacted soil. Mainstream explanations attribute this to rising street levels, an argument that collapses the moment you examine its global simultaneity. Did every major city on Earth choose the exact same decades to bury its own architecture? And why, in so many places, do the buried lower floors show ornate doors, large windows, and decorative facades, features no one would design for a basement? And then there were the pandemics. Cholera, typhus, smallpox, waves of disease sweeping through crowded urban centers, thinning populations, clearing neighborhoods. Mainstream history portrays these as tragic but natural episodes. But the pattern becomes suspicious when paired with the empty street photographs that soon follow. The cities seem ready, too ready, to be and woven through it all. War. From the Napoleonic campaigns to the Crimean War, from conflicts across Central Asia to colonial battles worldwide. The 19th century reads like a coordinated sweep across the territories once labeled Tartary on old maps. Borders changed, dynasties fell, populations were displaced, the past was overwritten, but it is the photographs that indict the century most powerfully. Images from the 1850s to early 1900s show grand cities: Paris, London, New York, Moscow, Philadelphia, so empty, they look abandoned. Streets wide enough for armies are devoid of movement. Plazas designed for thousands show not a single soul. Even when light conditions are perfect and the exposure time short enough to capture horses mid-step, the streets remain still, silent. At first glance, the photographs feel eerie. With context, they feel impossible. Cities of tens or hundreds of thousands of people should not look like that, not even for a moment. Mainstream historians offer the same explanation every time. Long exposure photography, moving objects simply don't appear. The problem with that explanation is simple. It is not true in the photos where shadows are crisp. Droplets of water are frozen, and small stationary objects, benches, barrels, wheelbarrows appear in perfect clarity. Even then, the streets remain empty. No crowds, no carriages, no animals, no signs of a living city. It is as if the world had been reset, its stage cleaned, its inhabitants removed, and its next generation yet to arrive. Which brings us to the most disturbing chapter of all, the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, more than 250,000 children were transported across America by rail alone, undocumented, unclaimed, They were lined up on platforms and selected by families in scenes that resemble livestock auctions. Official history describes this as a charity movement responding to urban poverty. But if the cities themselves were half empty, who were these children replacing? Why were there so many of them? And why do so many photographs of early orphanages show rows of babies, tuas, at a time arranged in primitive incubators like products in a factory? The theory suggests something far more chilling. Humanity was rebooted. The old population, the alleged Tartarian descendants, was lost to mud, fire, war, and deliberate removal. The new population is seeded into empty cities via institutions disguised as charity. If true, this changes everything, because the implication is not simply that Tartaria fell, but that the world we inherited was not built for us. The buildings, the roads, the proportions, even the technological remnants. We are tenants in someone else's architecture, placed here after a catastrophic cleansing, given new histories, and told to forget the silence that came before us. The fires erased the structures. The diseases erased the people. The mud erased the cities. And the orphan trains filled the void. But a reset is only half a story. A reset implies intent, purpose, a guiding hand shaping not just what we know, but who we are. And if such a force exists, then the next question becomes inevitable. What was their goal? And more importantly, why did they erase the world that came before? That answer begins where history ends, in the war for memory, energy, and the very shape of human consciousness itself. If the 19th century was the physical erasure of Tartaria, then the centuries that followed were its intellectual burial. Mud, fire, and war can destroy buildings. But to destroy a civilization completely, you must take something far more fragile: memory. This is where the story turns from archaeology to psychology, from architecture to ideology. Because after the smoke clears, after the bones disappear, after the empty streets are repopulated with children who have no past, the real work of rewriting humanity begins. The first battlefield is energy. In the Tartarian narrative, their civilization was built not on fossil fuels or steam engines, but on abundance's system of free atmospheric energy that required no wires, no pipelines, and no extraction. Domes, spires, towers, star-forged structures we call decorative become the functional components of a global resonant grid. They harnessed the Earth's natural frequencies, stored power in stone and copper, and distributed it without combustion or cost. It was a system no government could regulate, no banker could monopolize, and no empire could tax. This is the kind of technology that must be erased. To destroy a free energy civilization, you do not simply demolish the structures you replace the worldview. You manufacture dependence. You teach generations that energy is a scarce commodity extracted from the earth at great expense. You elevate oil barons and industrial titans into saviors of progress. You turn energy into a currency, a leash, a cage, and then you bury the old technology under the label of superstition and pseudoscience. Here, Nikola Tesla becomes the most tragic figure in modern history, a man who did not invent atmospheric energy, but rediscovered echoes of a lost science. His Wardenclyffe Tower, a structure of perfect Tartarian geometry, was shut down. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded. Morgan did not need a meter on it, he needed it gone. Tesla died with his notes confiscated, his research sealed, and his legacy rewritten as eccentric brilliance rather than forbidden continuity. That is how a civilization dies, not all at once, but piece by piece, until the things that once defined it become curiosities in museums, stripped of function and meaning. The second battlefield is history. Once the physical world is reset, the timeline must be locked into a new narrative. This is where official history, as taught in schools, universities, and textbooks, becomes not a record of the past, but a tool of containment. The modern timeline is built on a simple, powerful lie. Progress is linear. Humanity rises from primitive ignorance through steady stepstone, bronze, iron, steam, electricity, digital. Anything that violates this progression must be erased, ridiculed, or classified as myth. Myth becomes a vault, one that hides memories too large to fit the new story. The giants become legends. The star forts become military innovations. The domes become aesthetic flourishes. The world's fairs become temporary wonders. The buried cities become urban development. The missing skeletons become misprints. The empty streets become long exposures. The incubator wards become charity. The orphan trains become social welfare. Every anomaly is given a perfectly rational explanation. Neat and comforting, too comforting. A civilization is not erased by secrecy, it is erased by over-explanation. The third battlefield is identity. The deepest layer of the Tartarian theory is not about giants or buildings or free energy. It is about who we believe we are. Because if humans today were placed into the ruins of a more advanced civilization, then we are not the inheritors of history, we are the replacements. A new population introduced into a world already built, already wired, already mapped. A species with no memory beyond what we have been taught. A humanity disconnected from its own origin. To control a population, you must control its sense of self. The most effective prison is one that convinces you that freedom never existed. The most effective lie is one you never think to question. This is why Tartaria, if it existed, had to be erased so completely. A world built on harmony, abundance, and free energy would stand as a permanent indictment of our own society, of our poverty, our wars, our dependency, our environmental destruction, our monotony. A world like that cannot coexist with a world like this. And so a new humanity was shaped, a humanity taught that scarcity is natural, that struggle is inevitable, that history moves only forward, never backward or sideways. A humanity discouraged from looking too closely at the architecture towering over them, the anomalies beneath their feet, or the silenced chapters of their own past. But something unexpected happened. The fourth battlefield, perhaps the final one, is information. The internet cracked the wall. For the first time in centuries, ordinary people could compare old maps, examine photographs, study architecture, cross-reference anomalies, and question the narrators of history. The idea of Tartaria spread not because institutions supported it, but because they ignored it. And the more they dismissed, the more people looked. The more people looked, the more patterns emerged. This didn't disappear, was erased. That sentence became the rallying cry for a generation that felt instinctively that something in our history did not add up. Tartaria became a symbol not just of a lost civilization, but of our growing suspicion that the story we were handed is not complete. Whether the empire existed as described, whether the free energy grid was real, whether giants walked the earth, all these questions matter. But the deeper truth is simpler and more universal. We do not know everything about our past, and the strongest evidence for that is the effort spent convincing us we do. In the end, the war for memory is not one with fire or mud or rewritten textbooks. It is one with curiosity. When enough people begin to question, the official narrative trembles, and the buried world, whatever it truly was, begins to rise through the cracks in the concrete. The next step in that awakening begins in the silence beneath our streets, in the foundations that should not exist, in the doors that are too tall, in the maps that remember what we were trained to forget. There is a moment in every investigation when the evidence stops feeling like a collection of anomalies and begins to feel like a message, not written in ink, not carved in stone, but embedded in the shape of the world itself. A message that does not shout, it waits. And when you step through an old city, when you feel the cold breath rising from a sunken basement that should have been a ground floor, when your palm rests against a wall of granite too perfect to have been quarried with 19th century tools, when your eyes follow the impossible geometry of a star fort seen from above, you sense it. The past did not vanish. It is speaking, but only to those willing to slow down and listen. The silence beneath our feet is not empty. It is layered. Every buried doorway, every half-submerged window, every sealed archway is a remnant of a world that operated on principles we do not understand, and principles we were not meant to rediscover. The foundations of old cities are deeper than they should be, as if past generations built downward instead of upward. Some architectural seams suggest excavation, not construction. And when you follow the strange mismatch between form and function long enough, the question stops being, how did they build this? It becomes, who is this built for? The modern city masquerades as something new, but its skeleton is ancient. In London, entire districts sit atop older grids that no written record explains. In Paris, the famous Haussmann boulevards cut cleanly through neighborhoods whose previous layout remains a mystery. In New York, grand buildings appear in photographs before their supposed construction dates, immaculate and complete. In St. Petersburg, windows sit 10 feet below street level, lined with ornamental stonework as if meant to face the sun, not the soil. It is as though the world we walk through is a museum we mistake for a home. When you begin to see this, something shifts. History no longer feels like a story that began before you were born. It feels like a story interrupted, a missing middle chapter, a page torn out, and the reader was never told. Perhaps the most haunting clue of all is the emotional dissonance of the past. Old photographs show people standing awkwardly in cities too grand for them, like tourists in their own timeline. Their posture betrays a subtle unfamiliarity, not fear, not confusion, just a quiet mismatch, as though they had inherited something they didn't build and didn't understand. They look like visitors walking through the remnants of a world that whispered to them but did not belong to them. We carry that same dissonance today. We marvel at beauty we could not reproduce. We call certain buildings impossible, certain feats ahead of their time, certain ruins mysterious. But what if they're not mysterious at all? What if they are simply not ours? At the heart of the Tartarian question lies a deeper, more universal wound. The possibility that we were never given the truth about where we came from, what we once were, or what we might still be capable of. Our history, as presented, is neat to neat, a straight line of progress, carefully curated, a timeline trimmed of contradictions, an ascent that flatters the present moment. But the world is full of contradictions, and every contradiction is a doorway to a version of reality where the past was brighter, larger, more harmonious, more advanced than we dare imagine. A version where free energy was not fantasy, but function, where architecture resonated with the heartbeat of the earth, where geometry and power were inseparable, where humanity lived not in struggle but in alignment, where our buildings were instruments, where our cities were circuits, where our species was more than what we are now. If such a world existed and, if it was erased, then our amnesia is not an accident. It is a design. This is why the Tartarian hypothesis terrifies the establishment. It does not merely question historical dates or architectural techniques. It questions the foundation upon which modern civilization stands. The belief that scarcity is natural, that power must be centralized, and that human beings are small. A population aware of its true potential cannot be controlled. A population aware of a past built on abundance cannot be herded into systems of lack. A population aware of its forgotten giants cannot be convinced that modernity is the pinnacle of human achievement. This is the real threat of Tartaria, not that it existed, but that it suggests we were once more than we are now. And something in us knows it. Why else does the idea resonate? Why else does it haunt the imagination? Why else does the sight of a buried window or an impossible dome stir something ancient and electric inside the chest? Some mysteries disturb us because they hint at danger. Others disturb us because they hint at destiny. Tartaria, real or not, is a mirror. It asks us whether our ancestors were primitive or whether we are the ones living in the long shadow of a forgotten golden age. And this brings us to the wind down, the soft ascent after the storm of questions. So we slow down now. The pace softens, the noise settles. The world shrinks to the sound of your breath and the gentle hum of your thoughts. Imagine standing in an old city after midnight. The streets are empty. The lamps flicker softly. The buildings rise around you like sleeping giants. There is no rush, no urgency. Just a quiet awareness that the past is closer than you were taught, and that the stones beneath your feet hold more memory than any book. You look up at a dome that seems to glow faintly under the moonlight. You trace the lines of an archway, the grooves of a column. You notice how the proportions feel. Different, not wrong, just not scaled to you. A gentle question forms in the back of your mind. Not frightening, not demanding, just curious. Who walked here before us? What did they know that we do not? Why does the past feel so alive, even in silence? There is no fear in the question, only possibility. The world is full of buried stories. Some are myths, some are misinterpretations. Some are fragments of truth scattered like dust, and some are invitations. Tartaria may be one of them, an invitation to look closer, to doubt politely, to wonder softly, to listen to the quiet places where history forgot to close the door. Because sometimes the past does not need to shout. It only needs you to stop, breathe, and listen. And when you do, you may find that the silence beneath the streets is not silence at all. It is memory, waiting.